Now recording. Oh. And live.
Everyone in? Is that better? Yeah, no. That's better? Did you roll the DVD?
Okay, good morning. I'd like to call this Finance Committee meeting to order. It's Monday, September 21st. We have everybody present, Mike Burke via Zoom. And we'll just kick it right off with the first item on the agenda, which is the review of fiscal year 21 August financial report. Rich.
So we have the first financial report of the new fiscal year. We are projecting a year-end deficit of $1,099,374. This does include COVID-19 reopening expenditures projected at $1,606,968. We did include in the financial report a separate RC 28, to highlight those COVID-19 expenditures, which we'll also go over towards the end of the meeting. So the general education RCs are forecasting a surplus of $564,444. Special education RCs are forecasting a deficit of $56,850. And then again, the reopening expenditures of just over $1.6 million, which gets us to that projected deficit of $1,099,374. It does include in the forecast the need for one additional general education paraprofessional at Oxford due to enrollment, and then 4 additional special education paraprofessionals due to student needs. Those were flagged by Dr. Adley at the last regularly scheduled board meeting. So some highlights at RC5 Hinley. 5th grade is one section under budget based on enrollment, so that does leave salary savings of $76,701. Holmes is a kindergarten section under budget based on enrollment, leaving salary savings of $118,426. Oxford, due to enrollment increases after class sections were set, there is an additional need for a paraprofessional in 4th grade. That was the one mentioned earlier. That is leaving a projected deficit of $34,710. RC10 Tokenie, kindergarten is one section under budget based on enrollment, and that does leave a salary savings of $67,773. RC11, currently we are not having building rentals through December 30th, so we are forecasting less custodial overtime for the YMCA. That is leaving a projected surplus of $13,400. If this continues throughout the year, then this will obviously change. Currently, the weight room is not being utilized due to social distancing constraints, so this is leaving a favorable forecast of just over $6,200. And then currently, intramurals are not occurring. As a result, we are forecasting a partial year savings of $35,354. In RC12, use of fields has surpassed expectations, as our fields were rented during the summer due to virtual DSS. This is resulting in the forecast surpassing the budget by $33,316. And again, given we are not renting our buildings out until the end of the calendar year, we are forecasting a deficit in building rental revenue of $42,606, though the offset in fields reduces that by about $9,000. RC13 music, transportation is forecasted to be under budget by $6,000 as field trips are currently not underway. RC15 technology, there is salary savings in the copy center of $5,499 due to turnover. Moving to RC18, staff turnover has exceeded the budget by $47,773. We did have 30 certified teachers leave the district, resulting in staff turnover savings against a budget of 24, though many were towards that last few weeks of school reopening. We have received a few additional resignations since the report was put together. So obviously the timing in which those are filled might increase that staff turnover depending on the replacement costs of those individuals. Contract support is $26,448 to the positive, as the secretary's contract came in under budget. Budget control is forecasted at a positive $137,559. However, there is a need, that should say 4, additional special education paraprofessionals And we are recommending a transfer to utilize these funds to fund that need. RC23, summer school, DSS revenue did exceed estimates by about $20,000. RC24, teacher aides are forecasted at a deficit of $138,840. This again is due to the need for 4 additional paraprofessionals to meet student needs. The transportation driver position shows a positive forecast of $2,400 based on salary savings for a replacement driver. Tuition public schools is forecasted to be positive by a little over $163,000 due to student placement changes and return to district students. We did add a bullet for excess costs. So while the forecast currently remains to budget, as it's too early to determine any fluctuations in excess cost, the first submission, as always, will be in December 1st. We did reach out to the state to see if there was any preliminary indications of what the reimbursement rate will be. They said they expect it to be between 67 and 70%, though that, again, will not be finalized till sometime actually in the spring. We did budget a reimbursement rate of 75%. So this means if the expense estimates and our 4.5 times threshold, which is about 102,000 is what we budgeted, remains constant, we would lose 247,000 at 67% or 154,000 at 70%. Regular transportation is forecasted with a favorable balance of just over 35,000. This is due to the shortened school year of 180 days to 177 days. Property insurance is forecasted with a favorable balance of 1,180. Workers' comp is forecasted with a positive balance of 5,600. Student accident insurance is forecasted with a positive balance of 4,540. RC26 ELP, we are forecasting a negative variance of 83,617, and we currently only have 36 ELP students paying tuition against a budget of 48.
Any questions on that report? John?
RC 11, can you define a partial year? What date, what do you mean by partial year? A half year or?
A half a year.
Okay, thanks. And then the RC 24, the deficit of 138,000, the 4 additional special education powers, are those associated with the COVID? I mean, making.
No, those are just based on student needs, student IEPs.
So there are 2 new students entered in the district, and then the other 2 have changed since.
Okay,
Sorry,
so,
the other 2 have changed since the budget was done.
so it's not makeup or anything
No.
from last year. Okay, thanks. And then the last one, RC 26, the 36 versus 48 budgeted. Is there any way that there would be any associated expense savings on that? Because you have fewer students?
So as of right now, we have the same number of teachers. We do have a tendency to have students actually come in January and February. So
Okay.
this does not take into effect whether or not we will have that. We just have seen less parents enrolling their students.
Yeah.
So we might have some savings in paraprofessionals if they're not completely needed, but at this point, not really.
Too early to tell.
It's sort of a rolling admission. So throughout the year, you have students come in and you don't really reach your peak toward, mid-year in terms of enrollment with the LP. I have some
Wait,
questions.
sorry, just to follow up. So, but there's a negative variance as of today, not just because it's a rolling.
There is a negative
Yeah.
variance
Right.
as of today.
Okay.
So I guess my point is there's a possibility that more students could come in and out. It's very, the program's
Yeah,
more
I mean, it's
fluid.
early in the fiscal
It is.
year.
I mean, if we do get more students, obviously in January, they don't pay the full year tuition because they're only here,
Right.
for example,
Right.
for half the year. So we would expect a negative variance for the year in ELP, but it could shrink as the year progresses.
I guess the point is you baked into the budget the fact that we have increasing enrollment through the year. It seems like we're even lower than that. Is
Correct.
that-
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
For sure. Okay. You have some questions, Jill? Go ahead.
Okay. So my first question is, I'll just start with ELP. It's really a request for the next meeting. Alan and Richard, would you talk about ELP in your reopening discussion? Because I would imagine
Sure.
that having less kids has an impact, may or may not have an impact on facilities. Just if you would, and what that's doing with the program. It just would be nice to hear an update.
Sure.
So just to
yeah.
clarify, Jill, you want a facilities-related update as it pertains to ELP?
I want a programmatic update, but I would imagine that in addition to that, if there are any facilities impacts that ease spacing or anything like that, I'd like to hear that as well. It may
Could-
not, but I'm assuming we have the same number. of
Just to be clear, I think you're talking about in the COVID update of reopening
Yes.
kind of
Yes, 'cause
contextually, right? Okay.
it's not a budget question, but yeah. So that's the first. Thank you. The second on is ECR, a question on ECR, and I'm just curious to know, I'm sure there's not really an answer, but how accurate do we think our current baseline for ECR is? Because I know it's based on the budget of last year. Our kids are just back into the school system. So can we talk about how accurate this number is at this stage based on what we have?
Sure. So there are going to certainly be some changes. We did have some students who were out of district who came back to districts. Some students will have additional services. Some might that be for services that need to be made up for last year. So it is a bit of a moving target. Special ed is still conducting IEPs, which will determine some of the expenditures that we face. So excess cost is built for each individual student we have to submit the claim on. So it is a bit of a rolling target. While the percent reimbursement is expected to be less and it's not definitive, there's a potential that our expenditure could be higher, which will obviously offset some of the lost revenue. But if some of our expenses aren't higher, whether it's a student maybe left a high district, out of district placement and is coming into a lower out of district placement or even back to district, that could certainly change the whole calculation.
And just to add to that, the threshold, has that actually been established at this point, or is that still something we're
No,
waiting?
so
we
they
still
won't,
have
they
guidance
likely
on that.
won't establish the threshold until the spring. They do usually give preliminary guidance in December. So if you recall last year, the preliminary guidance was around 75%. It was 74.8. And then when we got to about end of February, it dropped to about 70%, 71%. So we'll likely see something similar. So typically what happens is the state has a pot of money. All the districts make their submissions in December 1st. They allocate those funds across the state of Connecticut based on the funds that they have set aside, which sets the reimbursement rate. And then all districts do another submission March 1st. And then obviously that kind of changes the balance and the weighting of the allocation to all the districts.
So Mrs. Richard, just a point of clarification, ECR is always based each year on student need and expenses by the district as an expenditure. It's not based on forecasting backwards or any previous experience. So we go based on our student needs, expenditures we've had, and then once the state sets the reimbursement rate, which is always late in the process, which is why we have such a conversation around budget season, but it's not based on previous experience as much as it's based on the individual IEP.
Right, that's why it's so fluid.
So it's
because
actual
very-
expenditures.
Right, right.
And
those are
other than
evolving and changing.
when the budget was set with what we projected for, what we thought we would need for this year, student-wise, and that's what it goes back to, but.
Right, it's a very difficult number to project, so.
The reimbursement rate is based on what we've experienced in the past, right? And that seems like it's slipping as time. goes
So
on.
the reimbursement rate is based on every district in Connecticut's submissions to the state. And then they look at what they've collected or it's been submitted, which is always more than the state has set aside. And that's when the state essentially applies a haircut across the state to kind of account for what they have versus what was submitted, which is why you'll actually see fluctuation every year.
So just for clarification, my question or point was about the 102,000 threshold. Is that established? Is that already established at this point?
No,
or-
so the state typically, it's called the net current expenditure per pupil.
Right.
They do the preliminary one in October, and then they do another one in end of January. So the preliminary one in October will give you that rough estimate that they give you in December. And then what happens is the state, every district has to submit a report called the EDO1, which kind of finalizes your expenditures from the previous years in certain buckets by the state. And then once the state, once that's audited by every municipality and then it's submitted to the state at the end of December, the state revises the NCEP for all districts, usually at the end of January. And then that's the threshold that they use.
And that's important because it's the expenses above that threshold.
Correct.
that
So
we're
we would have to
reimbursed
spend 4.5 times your net current expenditure.
Okay, so the problem is we have so many different factors that are so unknown even at this point until later in the year. So
Correct.
we do the best we can with the information that we have. But it looks like it's definitely that ECR reimbursement rate is definitely on a downward projection. that?
Speaking with somebody at the state, they expect it to be much less than the past.
Okay, so that's something that we should just keep an eye on, and I sort of had talked to you a little bit offline about communicating with Jen and the Board of Finance to make sure that they're aware of functionally how ECR works and just where it is in terms of the process and notification. And I'll bring that up again at the full board meeting. I just think it's good to make sure that the Board of Finance is aware of this downward trajectory with the ECR reimbursement rate. Because as you can see from these numbers, it could be $250,000 off of our budget as a result. So just sorry to interrupt, Jill, but if you have more
It's okay.
questions, you can go.
No, I think that was a good time to interrupt. I have a couple high-level questions. So we are clearly looking at where we're forecasting deficits. Are there areas where we're thinking, are we doing it on an actual basis? Are there areas where we're forecasting other kinds of savings? And I'm thinking of things like shared materials, other things where, how operationally are you looking at that? Are you waiting to sort of see what happens? Or are there some categories where we're looking like we're not going to be spending that we could start looking at forecasted savings?
So I think for,
Go ahead.
so I think for this report, we wanted to flag specifically the salary savings for the enrollment sections that are under budget. So it's clear to everybody where those three sections are. At a future meeting, we'd probably make a recommendation to transfer those savings to the COVID-19 RC. And then obviously, depending on how the board votes, then you'd actually see a smaller budget go into that RC 19. It's one of the reasons why, while the reopening expenditures on an operating basis are 1.6, we're only projecting that $1.1 million deficit. One of the areas we flagged was transportation, which is really just the 3 days for the shortened school year. If there are other items that materialize as the year progresses, obviously it's usually a rolling forecast. We'll start to flag those, whether it's co-curricular items or materials like you mentioned, or any other items.
Okay. So related to that, if I may, my last question, there's a couple areas where I think we're going to have some budget abnormalities that we'd be looking at just in terms of managing going forward, or abnormalities where we're going to have swings in traditional budgets. So did I just understand you to say that you're going to create a COVID-19 bucket for some of the COVID-19 expenses, the other two areas, and then I'd love to hear your answer. The other area is, how we'll be thinking about remediation. I think we want to be talking about, I know we don't know anything about it now, but there are potentially going to be expenses related to whether we have to bring in staff to support a kindergarten section, or maybe a first grade section that didn't get any reading. And so we need to add in some support there, or other forms of intervention, whether we build up our SRBI program a little bit, things like that. So how we're going to think about and track that. And then I'm thinking like a more typical account would be turnover, where obviously we've had a large turnover year and we're going to have a wiggle. So I'd just love to know sort of from a.
So I'll do the big question. You can do that. There are sort of assistance for students where we know those, we will budget for them accordingly as best we can. But there are some cases where we really don't know, and speculating is, there's a lot of speculation in those.
Sure.
There's a lot of variance there that could be, and I certainly wouldn't want to, it's such a variance that I wouldn't want to project that unless I had guiding indicators that would suggest that I can make that recommendation, Del. That's the big one for me there. The other ones you can go ahead.
So we did create another RC in the actual details of the finance report, RC 28 at the very end. So the 7 teachers that were added due to reopening and social distancing are actually coded there as opposed to the schools, since they're not enrollment based. The additional custodians that were needed are coded into RC 28, the LPNs, for example. You talked a little bit about materials. There is a line item in that RC called resource materials. And so this was some of the added materials, whether it was for those added sections or whether it's materials that were needed because they can't share materials. Some of the technology items, whether it's the charging stations, because the kids can't share Chromebooks anymore, or some of the software items like Seesaw, that's all coded into that RC so that we can kind of segregate that out. And then obviously when we do the budget for next year, hoping that fiscal 22 isn't obviously going to be a repeat of fiscal 21, you won't have that little bit of a disparity. The turnover is probably going to be artificially high compared to what you would see in a normal year. We did exceed turnover estimates this year by almost $50,000, and I would expect it actually to grow a little bit during the year. You'll see on the PAR that happens tomorrow that there were a couple more resignations, and so obviously we'll track that and we'll add that to the turnover bucket. So we'll have to make that caveat when we look at the budget going for fiscal 22.
John?
I just want to compliment creating that RC because the transparency involved in that, it's going to be great in understanding and further budgeting. On the flip side, it's tough to take the cost savings and put them in a separate RC, right? So you're going to have to almost call out cost savings relative to COVID. I mean,
Yes.
as we go forward, is that how we should think about it?
Yeah, and I do think we're taking just a wee bit of an attitude of wait and see on some of these because what we think is going to happen versus what is happening. When the board chair and I talked to the Board of Finance chair, we indicated that we would reflect those savings where they're appropriate to reflect the savings. So we are going to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's very helpful in kind of envisioning how this plays out.
So just building on that, I know we're going to see the Board of Finance next month at their meeting. We're going to give them an update. Where do you foresee a possible funding request happening down the line? I mean, at this point, it's too early, obviously, but do you have any sense of that at this point?
So we talked about this at OPC.
Okay.
We really wouldn't anticipate that unless the administration came forward with a dire need until January. After the turn of the year, we would be looking to run our appropriation as far as we can before going back to a special appropriation. Chairman Zagrodsky and the moderator of the RTM, Seth Morton, all kind of were in agreement along with Kate. And in my conversations with Alan and Rich, that's probably the best way. So I wouldn't anticipate it really until we as a group reflect on our costs, past midpoint, and unless there's any real dire need to go back because of some unforeseen event.
So up until that point, if there are financing or funding needs, we can make transfers as appropriate as we move along. And then when in January, we'll have more conversations. So you think January, those conversations will begin, or that's when you think the funding will be necessary?
I think the goal is to keep everyone updated. We've been talking, we were hoping to go to the Board of Finance in September. We had labor negotiations, which impacted our ability to meet, although everyone has agreed special meetings can be called as needed, either Board of Ed, Board of Finance, RTM. I think everyone's really looking to work together. But in terms of an appropriation, I think we're committed to, excuse the phrase, squeeze the most we can out of this budget before going back for additional tax dollars from the general fund.
I think it's general practice.
Yep.
Not that I'm speaking for the board as to what they want to do, but it's generally general practice to play it out, to see how long, and if the Board of Education would be able to cover the deficit as it changes.
So I guess just to make sure that the Finance Committee is hearing that and understanding that, and I guess on board with that, just get a sense of where everybody comes out.
Yeah, and just one follow-up, and then would there be a second appropriation at the end of the year, or would you be budgeting the appropriation for the full year at that January?
So I think our initial take, and again, this is what we were discussing in OPC, would be that we would go in chunks of what we need, given that the situation unfolds. So while nobody likes to drag out a process, if we could go for what we needed, and then if we needed more, go back again, hopefully not having to, but that would be the goal rather than projecting out a whole half a year type thing.
Awesome, thank you.
I think that would give you just the smaller amounts and more increments gives us the ability to maybe impact the taxpayers in the general fund less, because we'll have a more accurate understanding of where I think of it as like tranches.
Yeah.
So like a revolving credit or something similar. So Jill, what's your sense of it, just from the Finance Committee perspective?
I think that makes sense. Absolutely. I'm glad of it. I think the only other thing I would ask is that we agree to sort of what we're planning to bring to the Board of Finance, or just have an understanding of what the administration is planning to present, so that we're all in agreement on, whether you're going to bring these reports or.
So maybe at our next, I don't know I'm not exactly sure when the Board of Finance update would be, but perhaps at the next Finance Committee, we could just walk through what we think we're going to present to the Board of Finance, and then the full board maybe gets a chance to look at that beforehand? Is
For
that-
the most part, it's going to reflect discussions around the memorandum that's attached here.
Okay.
And the variation in that memorandum, whatever the most current, up-to-date
Okay,
version of that
as
is.
long as there's,
Well, the nice thing is it's numbers, right? So the numbers will be the numbers and we'll present them open and
as long as
transparently.
they're,
and
you know,
Yeah, this,
we're not
when we think of a
surprised.
deliverable, this is the form you're thinking about.
That sounds,
Well, some form of the attached, expenses at the back here
Yeah.
for COVID, yes, some form of that.
Cool, thank you.
okay, great. Sounds good. And Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. It sounds like no. Okay, so we.
Looks
start-
like it now.
I have, he's like, leave me alone. I do have some questions too. So I just wanted to give my committee members a chance first. So I wanted to touch on RC 11 and just the YMCA, we're not having building rentals. That means the YMCA is not coming into our buildings and utilizing our facilities. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And do you think that's going to impact our overall agreement that we have with the YMCA and more, I'm thinking of it from a financial perspective?
Well, there's a history there.
Right,
Most of the history circulates like a use of facility. And when I talked to the executive director, she's not inclined just to say, well, you're not going to be able to swim or whatever it happens to be. That's not the case. Now, if that changes, just as honestly, our position sort of evolved over the last month or two, then I would respect her ability or need maybe to come back to us. But at this point, we did mention that and it wasn't taken off the table as,
Okay. I just wanted to
she's
touch
been
on
very flexible and understanding as best it could be.
that. Okay, very good. So I wanted to see if Rich could just give us, I want to look at the FTEs, like where we started in terms of the budget. And then I know there are COVID related FTEs and then there are other FTEs that are related to more normal operations. So I wrote it down somewhere. I think we started in our budget. No, maybe this, I'm sorry.
106.
106?
I think you're looking at just elementary. 106 is just the elementary. the K-5.
Right. Well, I'm looking at
Okay.
total staff, so
Okay.
total FTEs,
Yeah, okay.
And
Sorry,
I-
what are you referring to, just so?
full-time equivalent. So it's basically, it's not in, I mean, it's in the bigger packet that the more detailed packet that you
Okay.
get.
You're not referring to, but.
No,
Got it, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm sort of going off on a little bit of a tangent. But I just wanted to get a sense of where we are right now in terms of FTEs and what is the net, basically what is the net increase?
So as of right now, we're +7 for those 7 elementary teachers, though there is a recommendation to fund 5 additional paras, so the 4 special education paras, and then the 1 general education para at Oxbridge.
Right,
So when factoring in that, you'd be +12.
so plus 12 over where we.
Over
were.
what the budget was adopted
Okay,
at.
but
Correct.
7 of those we would say are related to COVID.
Correct, in our 1 year only.
Okay, great. And so where does that leave us now at total current staff?
So excluding the paras, we're at 772.5 essentially. And then if you add in the 5 paras, 777.5.
Okay. So it's 5 paras?
So 4 special education and
Okay,
then 1
4, and
general
then just the
education.
one, now the one for Oxbridge, is that big class, that
Correct.
large size class, we're putting a para into that classroom, is that right?
Where we're I think as historical practice, we're putting paraprofessional in the actual 4th grade.
Okay,
Because all the classes there are relatively,
so in other words, they could potentially all have access to that
Correct,
additional
correct, yep.
paraprofessional, okay. I think that is all I had, because everybody else, I wanted to touch on ECR, and I think we touched on that. And we touched on ELP, so I guess if nobody has any other questions, we can move on to talking more about the item number 2, which is the COVID reopening of school projected expenditures.
So similar to the previous month, we did include a breakdown of reopening expenditures. We did isolate them in buckets of staffing, facilities, technology, materials, and transportation. So the total reopening expenditures are forecasted at $2,089,211. We did receive, and we have the funding as of Friday, $134,611 for the ESSER grant. The state has also indicated coronavirus relief funds that'll be awarded to Darien of $347,631. So that brings the net operating down to the $1,606,000 that we talked about previously.
Hey, Rich, can you reiterate that, that last number? Sorry, I couldn't
Sure.
hear.
So the gross number is $2,089,211.
Yeah.
We did receive, and we have the funds now in hand, the ESSER grant for $134,611. The state's awarded us $347,631 for the coronavirus relief funds.
347?
$347,000.
Thank you.
That we have not received yet. We're waiting for the state to open up the grant management system
Yeah.
to apply for, but that's at least the award amount that the state has indicated. So taking into account those two grant numbers, the amount is $1,606,969, which is what we referenced in the financial report.
Thank you.
So looking at staffing, it is just over $1 million. That does include benefits for the additional teachers. Facilities, that's really been the area of growth since we started sharing this last time. That is a total dollar amount of $640,955. We do have some areas of reimbursement, whether it be for the ESSER grant or the coronavirus relief fund. One of the areas that's grown particularly is the plexiglass partitions. We did add plexiglass to the teacher desks, as well as the campus monitors, secretaries, the student desks, or tables that are in the elementary school. And then custodial supplies. Obviously, we've been adding like sanitizing wipes, sanitizing spray, things like that. Technology is about $270,000, though $92,000 of that is in the ESSER grant that we received that I had mentioned earlier. And this includes increasing our internet speed, enhancements to the firewall, the charging stations, the document cameras, and then some software, whether it be Zoom, Screencastify, Book Creator, or Seesaw. And then materials. So there's been materials that are needed both to ensure that students don't share materials, but also materials for the added sections that was referenced earlier. And it's art materials, it's literacy materials, music materials, math materials, and then bus sanitation costs. We are sanitizing the buses in the morning between runs because we do have a 3-tier system, so they get sanitized between each tier after each drop off. So the gross number again is $2,089,211. We have grants just over $480,000 between the ESSER grant and the coronavirus relief. And then that amount is $1.6 million in the operating account. And that's obviously before any transfers that are considered or approved. So if there are transfers that we bring forward and the board approves, what we'll end up doing is inserting a column in here that'll indicate what the transfer is. And then you can see what the actual net amount is. The reason for that is so that everybody still understands what the gross amount of the expenditure would be. But then you can at least see kind of how it gets brought down a little bit.
That sounds good.
Well done.
That's great. I think this is a great tracking mechanism. So questions on this? Jill?
Just one, the elementary library air conditioning units and electric upgrade, what is that one?
So if you recall, there is no air conditioning in the elementary libraries with the exception of Tokenique. So some of the, because of spacing needs, they've moved things like speech and some other items into the library. So we did install air conditioning units in the 4 elementary libraries. But in order to do that, they had to do an electrical upgrade so that the school can support the electrical load of those air conditioning. So it's air conditioning at the 4 elementary schools, so the one not being Tokenique since it is essentially air.
So all 4 elementary schools got an air conditioner in their library and an upgrade.
Correct. So they need the electrical load upgrade to run the air conditioning.
Thank you.
So technology, are we seeing that upgrade is enough, or do we anticipate that we might need more capacity and an additional expense? Or is the 3 gigabytes seeming to be enough?
I think for the internet speed, it seemed to be enough.
It seems to be at this point, yes.
Okay, just, once we go back full in person, I don't know if it's going to start to ramp up with more kids there, more usage.
Well, it's kind of based on right now that everybody is using something right now.
Okay.
So I think the department has planned accordingly. I'm certainly happy to double check, but I don't anticipate that.
So we do get our internet from the state. It's CEN is the provider. So if we do have to increase it to 4 gigabytes, it's just kind of like a reach out to the state. You don't have to necessarily do the enhancement to the firewall that you previously did, but you would have to pay for the added internet speed.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm just curious.
Tech support, things are starting to calm down a little, I guess. I'm hoping.
They're busy.
They're still busy.
Look,
Okay.
in all honesty, if they had another couple of sets of hands, they could use them. It's actually getting someone, which is a problem.
Yeah, okay, so that's the same story as we heard last week.
Yes.
If you, obviously, if there is that need, it would be COVID related because of everything going on. So I would think.
So they are understaffed. If we look at the staffing model that we have about 1,400 devices, student devices at the high school, and you have 2 techs stationed there. You now have 2,100 devices across all 5 elementary schools, and you don't have a dedicated elementary school technician. So it does obviously stretch thin the technology staff. I mean, they've been working 7 days a week, probably 12, 15 hours a day to handle things. We heard about the help desk tickets, and those are
Right.
obviously
1,000 in one day.
So
Well,
do you
let's-
anticipate bringing forward a request for additional staff and tech support?
I've had that discussion. At this point, that has not come full circle. It may be something that probably is reflected in next year's budget, potentially. But if we need it, I'll certainly bring it forward. And if the department needs it and has a solution, if the department needs it and we have a solution of how to construct it, then we'll bring it forward.
On that note, Alan, tomorrow when you speak to reopening, would you speak a little bit on tech? I'd love to hear how we're doing on, numbers of tickets. I'd love to hear how the fully remote day went in terms of a load on the system. I'd love to hear how, sort of where we are in terms of our number of devices and how many we've had to replace.
Point of order. I don't want to, it's not really related to finance, but go ahead and put your request in, but let's just make sure we focus on finance.
But what I'm asking that we understand programmatically what it looks like so that if there is a finance request, there's some history of why we got there.
Okay.
So I think we all want to support the tech department. It's the backbone of what we're doing. So thank you.
So I just want to caution, we've been off agenda twice, but if there's any requests for meeting, if you send them in, I'm more than happy to get them to the superintendent so he can prepare for tomorrow's meeting. But I don't want the finance committee to get in trouble for being off agenda. But if there's any requests, send them to me. I'll get them to Alan so he can prep for tomorrow.
Any more questions on the reopening projections for COVID? Any more questions on, because then we can move over to budget transfers. We can talk about that more specifically.
So we'll just kind of go through the PowerPoint and then talk about the transfers at the
Okay.
end. So as I mentioned, we are forecasting a deficit of just under 1.1 million. Again, the majority of that is the reopening expenditures at 1.6 million. The COVID reopening expenditures, we just have it broken down between the operating account grants and then the total. So again, that operating account number is the 1.6 million, the grants of just over 480, totaling a little under 2.1 million. Salary savings, we are in the negative for salaries due to reopening costs. You'll see at the bottom the $910,000. So overall salaries are over by about 546. Operating, we are over about 382,387, but again, you'll see the majority of that is the reopening expenditures. Fixed, we are positive by 46,789. The majority of that is the savings identified for transportation for those 3 days of the shortened school year. Equipment is in the negative 144,876, and again, that's the reopening expenditures, primarily technology equipment. Revenue is forecasted slightly short of budget at 72,490, and the majority of that really is ELP tuition being short about 83,000, building rentals 42, but field rentals are higher by about 33,000. So we do have 2 transfers for the board to consider tomorrow night. The first is for 4 additional special education paraprofessionals. We are recommending the utilization of budget control. Is slightly more than the total amount set aside in budget control. So the difference would be about $1,200, which would come from salary savings and staff turnover. And then the second transfer is for the additional general education paraprofessional at Oxford, which is due to enrollment. And then we would recommend taking the funds from the additional salary savings and staff turnover. So if you remember during the previous report, we were about a little over $40,000 to the positive in turnover. So we would be using the majority of those funds to fund that.
That looks good to me. Any questions on those transfers? Any issues with those transfers? Great. Just real quick before we wrap up, I meant to touch on it earlier. Are we seeing any uptick in legal expenses?
I'm sorry, could you say that?
Legal expenses?
Legal expense? So we haven't gotten our legal bills. Legal bills do typically lag a couple months in arrears. So we'll obviously check that out. I think we obviously have negotiations going on with the teachers union and the administrators union. So I would expect a slight uptick in general education legal fees due to those negotiations.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So now we're on to public comment. Do we have any public comment?
Good morning. Good morning. If you would like to speak during public comment, click the participants icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raised hand option. You will notice a blue hand icon appear in the upper corner of your screen where your face, name, and/or number appears. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you are unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. There are no raised hands at this time.
Okay. Motion to adjourn? All in favor? Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.